What does the latest trade and inflation data out of China tell us about the direction of the world's second largest economy? And does that data corroborate the perhaps radical outlines that we're seeing in their 14th five-year plan? Jeff, today you posted an essay at Real Clear Markets, and the title of it is Xi Jinping is Mao, only for his focus to be on technology. Jeff, the Communist Party of China seems to have come to an agreement on the outlines of their 14th five-year plan. And you start off your article by taking us back to the very first Chinese five-year plan. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I could tell you quite a lot about it. Look, the communists took over in 1949, and after consolidating political power across mainland China, at least in the early 1950s, they began to assert their Marxist theories on the overall Chinese economy, which at the time was, a very feudal, backwards, agrarian subsistence farming system, and so they actually imported thousands of engineers from the Soviet Union and essentially copied the Russians' first five-year plan from 1928 and adopted it to a Chinese format, basically almost word for word, direct translation from Russian into Mandarin. And so the first five-year plan was, we got to focus on China's ability to make things, because if you don't make things, you're always going to be borrowing stuff from the imperialist dogs and the imperialist pigs, and you'll never have a socialist paradise. And so the focus of the first five-year plan, as the first Russian five-year plan, was heavy industry. We got to be able to make steel, and if you got to be able to make steel, you got to have fuel. So you got to have coal. You have to have all sorts of infrastructure that transports, coal from the ground to these steel factories, and you got to have workers. But, communists always like to manage these things from the top down. So there was a bureaucratic system that was also growing up with the adoption of this first five-year plan, which focused on industry.
And as far as these things go, Jeff, I would say that the first five-year plan was a success. And that gave them impetus and momentum into the second five-year plan, which was kicked off in 1958. And this one organized farmers into industrial workers, reducing the number of hands tilling the fields. And that's all well and good if you can still produce the same amount of food or necessary amount of food to feed the people that are now in the factories. Tell us a little bit about the second five-year plan.
Well, let's specify the first five-year plan was successful in that it met and exceeded almost every single one of its targets, and that gave the Mao and the communist authorities in China the quote unquote proof they needed that they were on the right track. And what China had that Russia didn't was an overwhelming amount of untapped labor. Obviously, the Chinese population was far exceeding, even though the Russian population wasn't small, the Chinese population far exceeded it. So Mao said, look, we've got all of these people and on these dirt farms farming rice at very inefficient means. We can use them to help us speed up our industrial processes. So unlike the Russians, who had trouble in their first five-year plan and the agricultural production plummeted because so many workers were pushed into industry, in China during their first five-year plan, they didn't have that problem. So they met their industrial targets. Agricultural production didn't fall off. So they thought for the second five-year plan starting in 1958, they would push more and more of their agricultural potential, let's say, into not just industry though, but the worst kind of it, just inefficient means. Rather than building factories for all this workforce to move and build high quality steel or produce high quality steel or high quality products, Mao's second five-year plan just said, we'll just have this quote unquote idle labor that's working the fields as they are now, making steel in their own backyards, in their own collectivized communes. And so it was really one of those hubristic, ambitious, overly suggestive ideas that just got way out of control.
And the understatement of the year is way out of control, because that was the great leap forward. And as you write, it's one of humanity's greatest catastrophes. I've got some stats according to the numbers you cite. Between 15 and 60 million people starved. Wikipedia puts it between 23 and 55. One of the authors that puts the number at 45 million dead said it wasn't all from starvation. He notes that at least 2.5 million people were beaten or tortured to death, and 1 million to 3 million committed suicide. It was a catastrophe that sort of echoed what we saw in the Soviet Union with their agricultural, the famine that developed there.
Yeah, and it's also, look, when you're stuck on it, when your farm, you were a private, subsistence farmer beforehand. When the communist government comes in and collectivized, that wasn't just them taking away your land and making you share the land with all your neighbors and all the surrounding communities. It meant that you're stuck there. You cannot leave. And if you do leave, they're going to catch you, because there's something called a Hukou registration system, which says you're supposed to be here, not here. And if you're not here, instead of where you're supposed to be, you are subjected not just to deportation back to your rural dirt farm commune. It was also, you're going to be heaped with public humiliation and rebuke, official rebuke in the form of torture or prison, whatever, just for trying to leave your commune that didn't have enough food. And the reason it didn't have enough food was because the central planners had created essentially a Potemkin system, a system whereby they set these targets, they met them in the first 5-year plan, and because they expected them to be met in the second 5-year plan, they also meant business. They also meant, look, these are your targets, you're going to meet them. And so local leaders were telling their Central Party communist leaders that, yeah, we are producing the same amount of food. And they weren't, not by a long shot. And one reason why they weren't was because they also had to produce the same amount of steel that was in the targets. And they couldn't produce the same amount of steel because they weren't real steel makers. These were backyard furnaces spewing out pig iron, which was also useless. So in the second 5-year plan, they met all their targets, but in terms of steel making and some of these backyard industrial heavy industry, it was worthless product and phantom agriculture. And yet, from the central planners' perspective, all their targets were being met. And it combined into this absolute human catastrophe of genocide.
We're going to skip ahead a few 5-year plans to the 5th one, which was special.
I do want to mention, Emil, and I put it in the article, that there was a memo that the U.S. CIA had produced in June 1959 when they were hearing remember, we didn't really know about what was going on in China at the time because China was a very closed society. And so the CIA, of course, had interest into figure out what was going on in society. And so they had a pretty lengthy memo produced in, I believe it was June 1959, talking about this leap forward stuff. And let me tell you, you got to just shake it. The CIA, man, they were very positive on how the Chinese were going to be able to do what the Russians hadn't, that the Chinese were going to be able to be successful with their second 5-year plan and not suffer the same agricultural setbacks that the Russians had. And it was one of those you just have to shake your head at these, the idea of establishment analysis and things like that.
That's right. It said that the country would do at least as well as the USSR. And I was going to bring it up, but I got a call earlier today not to bring it up. So we'll see if I can get it through the censors when we upload it to YouTube. The 5th 5-year plan, Jeff, we started to turn the corner. Okay, there were a couple of notable things. One of them not so wonderful is the one-child policy. But then the 1976 to 1980 5-year plan, it was special. What happened from there?
Well, between the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine and the catastrophe that was, Mao Zedong was sidelined because even the communists said, you have no idea what you're doing here. This is totally screwed up. But that led to a backlash because in the early 1960s, Mao said, well, it wasn't our fault. Blame the Russians. We copied their 5-year plans, and obviously the Russian 5-year plan isn't going to work in China. And so Mao made a comeback in the middle 1960s, which led to the Cultural Revolution, which wasn't as bad in terms of human catastrophe, but it was still a human catastrophe, and certainly a political catastrophe, as Mao created this iron grip cult of personality over China. And so that lasted into the middle of the 1970s as the Chinese economy essentially stagnated for the entire period there, until a guy named Deng Xiaoping started to take over and move the pendulum back in the opposite direction. Deng was no free market capitalist. He was a committed communist, but he at least had enough sense to realize, look, this Maoist stuff was a complete and total disaster. It was a mistake. So moving forward, China will never again have an undisputed dictator, cult of personality like we had in Mao. We're going to rotate. We're not going to vote. We're not going to have a republic, but we're going to at least not have a single leader hold the reins of power for year after year after year. We'll have maybe 4-year terms, 5-year terms for the president or head of the central committee, and we'll even rotate who's head of the army, who's head of the government. We'll do all these things, sort of a very limited communist checks and balances, because we don't want to go back to the way it was done under Mao. And in addition to that, in the terms of the economy, Deng and his followers began to look at the economy as socialists don't create wealth, which is what Karl Marx said. Karl Marx said, look, communism doesn't create wealth. It only redistributes what's made. So if the Chinese were going to survive in a communist system, they had to at least look forward and think about, well, how are we going to get out of this mess that we've been left into with Mao? And so the fifth 5-year plan was the first that introduced special economic zones and also some more private property, market-oriented reforms that began China on its path towards modern transformation.
In 1992, he went on his famous Southern tour, in which he opened up the economy even further. And if you remember, of course, this was after 1989, then the Tiananmen Square protests. So the situation was tense in China, and further reopening was needed for economic growth. And Jeff, I think
Emil, that was where the pendulum swung all the way into the other direction, the anti-Maoist direction. Now, obviously, it didn't in political terms, but in economic terms, especially after Tiananmen Square had led to such public global scorn and global shunning of China after what happened there, Deng realized, especially in the wake of the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had happened in 1991. In 1992, he realized, look, this is an all or nothing position. Either we do it this way, or it's going to we're going to go the way of the Soviet Union. And so the pendulum had swung all the way back in the other direction, where China said, look, we're going to continue to be politically autocratic. We're going to be communism. We're going to be top down, but we really have to embrace at least a capitalist phase, because otherwise it just doesn't work. We need to build up the wealth of the Chinese society, because it's reached its limits.
And I think it was great fortune that at just that moment, the Eurodollar pedal was pushed to the metal. Because if this had happened, let's say 10 years earlier, in 1982, just when half the world fell into depression during the LDC crisis, when South America went into depression, Africa went into depression, I don't know if the economy would have taken off at any, well, maybe because it was at such a subsistence level. There was, low food. I guess it could have grown, but it was great circumstance that the Eurodollar tide floated China all the way past 2008, 2009. But until about 2011, 12, things started to inflect. And then the 13th 5-year plan, the first one under Xi Jinping, said it's over. The pendulum doesn't swing one way forever.
Yeah, and that was the first time that people talk about rebalancing. That was where it first started to show up in official circles, which was the government saying, there's a lot. All of a sudden, all the problems that had cropped up during those 2 decades of quote unquote miracle growth or Eurodollar fueled growth in China, pollution, corruption, inequality, all of these things that were always there. Suddenly they started to matter around 2013 and 2014 as the global economy failed to recover from the Great Recession, and China didn't continue on its merry way as a lot of people thought a lot of the emerging markets and especially Asia would. And so what Xi was saying was, the way that we had been doing things since Deng Xiaoping and again, the pendulum swinging toward the free market, we may not be able to do them anymore because we don't see the same levels of economic growth that allows those things to continue to happen. So the 13th five-year plan began to reorient the Chinese priorities toward a very different model of internal, exclusive, more of an island, less globalized, less part of the global community, less globalization, certainly not counting on globalization, which in raw economic terms means we don't see the export growth anymore. So where the hell are we going to get our growth from?
And if anyone knows their Chinese history, it's perfectly natural for China to withdraw from the world. That happens repeatedly. The first time it was brought to my attention that may happen again, as hard as that would be to believe, was by Anne Stevenson Yang, a well-known Chinese expert. And she brought that up in late 2015, early 2016 to my memory. And Jeff, let me read a quote here from you about the third Eurodollar disorder. And that'll segue us into where we are today. We'll talk about some of the latest numbers in the 14th five-year plan. But let me go back in time a little bit here. Quote, while in the West, there would be sustained celebrations and hysteria over an inflationary acceleration short on evidence in 2017, in China, there began preparations for the exact opposite of those. She, not Janet Yellen, guessed correctly. Both had an abundance of numbers, the bond market, showing them there really was only one way this could ever end up.
That's the Eurodollar. That period, 2014, 2015, 2016, was a crucial time period in that in China, not just China, but the rest of the world, it showed that the reflation number three, that small rebound from the downturn that had happened during that period. First of all, there wasn't supposed to be a downturn. It was supposed to be global recovery. And second of all, it was sharp in emerging markets in Asia, especially China, where government authorities on Xi's side, as opposed to those on Li Kekang's side, were saying, this seems to be permanent. This is where we're seeing, our inflection happened in 2011, 2012. Now it's 2015, 2016, 2017, and we're just not seeing this global growth stuff. It's become clear to us that what we were planning for, what we had planned against in the 13th five-year plan, it is actually coming to fruition in that we need to change how China does economy and everything else that goes from it. Because one of the economy is just where it starts. I mean, first of all, as we said before, under Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping thought, or Deng Xiaoping theory, we would never have a permanent dictator holding all the reins of power again. That's what they said. China's communists said, we need to share power, at least among a small group of people. And since Eurodollar number three, more and more Xi has been consolidating his power. In the 19th Party Congress, he set up the conditions so that in 2018 at the National Party Congress, or the National People's Congress, whatever it's called, that he could not only have power in all three arenas, government, military, police, and all these other things, but that he could hold power permanently, that he could cultivate a cult of personality. And so politically anyway, the Chinese have, the pendulum has swung far back in the direction of Mao. And now we're seeing with the 14th five-year plan, which is still being put together, only parts of it has been released to the public, but yet they're going even further than the 13th five-year plan, a lot further in my mind than the 13th five-year plan had gone, which corroborates and goes along with what we're seeing in the political arena, which is China basically telling you, we are planning for a future where China goes it alone. We're not counting on global growth anymore, because why the hell would we? We haven't seen it in a decade. Yes, we keep hearing Western central bankers talking about unemployment rates and all these other positive things, but it doesn't happen. And the Chinese government doesn't have the luxury of fooling itself, because they still have that original problem that showed up under the first five-year plan, which is they prioritize only the urban residents that Mao had, leaving the rural residents to be essentially second and third class citizens, and without the prospects of that Deng Xiaoping, the island of prosperity in between. The Chinese know they have a huge multi-hundred million people problem on their hands.
And let's put some numbers to what you're saying right now, that there is no more growth. And we don't mean literally no more growth, but metaphorically, or no, we don't mean it literally, but what is the word I'm looking for, Jeff?
Not enough. Not nearly enough.
Not nearly enough. Yes.
In that sense, it is. It's not. It's not really. If it's not enough growth, if it's technically growing, but it's not enough growth, it's really not growth.
Non-linear growth. Okay.
Yeah,
yes. So
it's always a non-linear.
So the third Eurodollar disorder began in 2014. Exports this year, for the most recent month reported right now, are up 11% year over year, but they're really only up in total 14.7% since 2014. Imports are up 11% since 2014. Just the most recent month, October, imports were up 4.7%. So while October's numbers look good, if you take a longer view, you see really we haven't grown enough.
Yeah, and you see that started to change around 2011 and 2012, and then really it became clear in 2014 and 2015 that the global economy, as it had been for Deng Xiaoping theory to continue to operate, or to continue as the underlying premise for Chinese economic planning, it just wasn't there anymore. The globalization, global trade, global economy, and of course what we're really talking about is the Eurodollar. That all broke down in the post-crisis era, and we can time that, we can map it to what we see politically and economically in China. And so we look at the 14th five-year plan in that context, what the Chinese are saying, what they're saying, and not even what they're saying, what they're actually doing is preparing for a future where they don't have global economic growth and globalization. They're preparing to try to go it alone because they believe they don't have any other choice. And they realize that this is a very risky proposition, which is why on the political front, the pendulum is swinging for Xi in very much the same way as it had for Mao. It's in that same autocratic, authoritarian direction, because this is a very, very risky proposition. That really is the point here, because why would the communist Chinese undertake such a risky proposition if they had any other choice?
You can also see it in the consumer prices. We were just talking about Europe. We were talking about the United States, how we don't see inflation there, signifying we don't see monetary growth or economic acceleration. And just this week, we learned that the consumer price data out of China is not any good either. Is that correct, Jeff? What did you learn from that?
Yeah, the CPI was the lowest it had been since, I believe, November 2009, somewhere in 2009, right? Late 2009. So it was the lowest in 11 years. And it was barely positive, down to, I think, 0.5% year over year. And that's still being masked a little bit by the Chinese pork problem that they had in 2019. A disease outbreak had called the pig herd in China and led to a massive spike in food inflation that is just now coming off. But as that food inflation starts to come down again, what it's revealing is that the underlying fundamentals outside of food, or the underlying inflation fundamentals outside of food in China, don't speak much toward a rebound in economic demand in China. Therefore, what China can contribute as far as global growth is concerned.
There's not enough money creation in the world. We see that in China, we see that in Germany, we see that in the United States. The corona has exacerbated it, but it was a problem that's been in place for at least 13 years. And we can't look to central bankers for a solution. Jeff, I don't think
we can look to Pfizer either, right? I mean, because to bring this all back to where we started, does the vaccine really change much about what we're really talking about? It can, in terms, I mean, obviously it's a very good development in terms of health and the situation with the virus and the pandemic, but economically speaking, fundamental economics, it really doesn't change much, and that's why I believe we haven't seen much outside of nominal treasury yields that have reacted to it.
Jeff, I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Yeah, you too, Emil. Take care.